This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
8,650 or so Palestinians have been murdered by Israel since October the 7th. 8,525 of those are in Gaza, 129 Palestinians murdered in occupied West Bank, Israeli-occupied West Bank. It is contrasted with a figure of 1,405 Israelis that have been killed by the resistance. Some of them have been killed by their own as there has been a very uncoordinated, very dear makar response by the occupation forces in the wake of October the 7th, when they were caught completely off guard in the Al-Aqsa flood effort, of course, by the resistance. And Israel, of course, since then has responded in a way that only truly it knows best, and that is with aerial bombing and aerial attacks, which has left untold damage and scars across the West Bank. Buildings such as churches, mosques, hospitals have all not been spared in Israel's aggression on the Gaza Strip, and of course in the West Bank, as it is completely and continuing to fail in Gaza. It continues certainly to target Palestinians living in the West Bank, as settlers continue as well to try and target the Palestinians. And one of the, I suppose, contextual questions that emerged since October the 7th, as the mainstream media had been pounding on this issue of supposedly Israel being attacked, there was the recognition that there is a 75-year occupation that one is dealing with, and it regurgitated the debate of how and where and what the context to the supposed conflict is. That what you had essentially was at the fall of World War II, when European Jews were persecuted by a Nazi Germany, that we had a scenario in which for largely white Europeans there was a decision by the English with the Balfour Declaration and others to essentially create a homeland for white European Jews that moved to a land where people had already been living, and of course we then saw the establishment of a political project called Zionism, which had used the principles of faith and Judaism to justify certainly their actions, and in fact in many parts had hijacked the principles of the faith by establishing this political project called Zionism. And so therefore it was no surprise when the Palestinians resistance had launched the historic operation called Al-Aqsa flood on October the 7th, shaking the occupation entity. It was the Western media and Western leaders and former colonial powers that certainly is confronting their own demons, as it were. For them, a while back already, there's been the fabricated, the clock only started to tick on the day that they demanded that Palestinians condemn themselves for their own act of resistance, conveniently pushing aside the 75 years of Israeli expulsion, occupation and terror. In this segment of NRA News Reviews and Analysis, we now discuss settler colonialism, its mentality, and largely the role that Western powers play and the media play in trying to dictate to the oppressed how they must respond to their own oppression. Dr. Pedro Mzileni is a sociology lecturer in the University of the Free State and a columnist at Al Jazeera English News. He speaks to us in his personal capacity. Dr. Pedro, very good morning and welcome.
Good morning to you and also to your listeners. Thank you for the invite.
It's a complex problem, a complex situation, which I suppose we cannot begin to be responsive to without looking at the context here, which I suppose is fundamental to any solution that we may well be speaking about.
Yes, I think your background is spot on. The situation in Palestine is as you've described it. We are now on the third week, and over 8,000 Palestinians have been killed by the white settler Zionist colonial project of Israel, which has been going on now for close to a decade. And the media needs to be strongly condemned by all activists, scholars, teachers, and everyone involved in the struggle for the Palestinian people to self-determine their own lives, their own land, and to live in peace. It's not a war that is going on there. It's a clear-cut genocide against the defenseless people. And what is also striking is that most of the victims there as well are children, who have been killed, and thousands more are injured. Close to 21,000 children are injured in this catastrophe, as we saw in the report released by UNICEF International recently. So also the Gaza area has been cut off, from water, food, medicine, and other essentials, including safe access to hospitals, even refugee camps. They've been bombed during this process. So Israel is behaving like any other colonial power when it is against the natives. It uses unspeakable crimes against humanity in the form of violence determined to kill, to annihilate, and basically to wipe out a population off the surface of the earth. So this is a racial cleansing exercise meant to dispossess the land and make sure that the entire surface of Gaza continues being occupied by settler colonialism, similarly to what has happened in South Africa, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, and even in the Americanas as a whole.
And the reality is that if you happen to be white and of supposed Jewish descent, and you live in Europe, you've born in Europe or in the United States or wherever else in the world you might find yourself, even in places like South Africa, and you have no linkages, no connection, no lineage to that particular land, you almost have an automatic passport to go and fly over to Israel, to go and live there. In fact, what we are told is that the occupation, in fact, pays for white Europeans to go and live in Israel, but the local indigenous people have for 75 years been driven off from their land. And so it raises some very serious questions here about what fundamentally, as you put it as well, is a racial undertone to the settler colonial project, and the fact that people that have absolutely no connection with that land are regarded as potential inhabitants, whereas the locals are being forced from it, and it sparks of an inherent, I suppose, contradiction. I want to just quickly, I know my question is a bit lengthy, but I want to juxtapose it with the example that I'm raising, or the question that I'm raising, on October the 7th, when there was, of course, a dance festival that was right next to a concentration camp called Gaza. It was right there on the border, and that a lot of those people that were killed and people that were in the immediate vicinity of Gaza or on that particular outskirts on the border were settlers that are often funded and armed by this entity. And so I want to just look at the whole concept of white Europeans and others, that seemingly feel that as if though that is their land and they can easily just go and settle there at the expense of the Palestinians.
Well, settler colonialism is a global project, initiated from the geopolitical center of Europe, So countries such as Britain, France, Spain, Germany, Italy, and also Portugal, they've been responsible for unspeakable crimes against humanity for the past 500 years across the whole planet, basically. And even if you are a nice white person, at the end of the day, these crimes are committed on your behalf, So anyone with a white skin color has a passport to move across the whole planet with the most powerful passport without any type of consequences on their lives, So there is a strong connection between colonialism, whiteness, and this global citizenship question concerning them as white people. You also see it here in South Africa. When we speak about foreigners or immigrants, we immediately assume that it's dark people who come from the continent of Africa, or people who come from Pakistan, the Middle East, and so on, whereas the white race is assumed to be tourists and investors, So it's the same situation also in Israel. The state was established out of unspeakable crimes against the indigenous population of Palestinian people. And the land was taken through a series of killings carried through the gun and racial cleansing, for white people purely to settle there, but also to gain control of the land and the resources of the area. And that's how white power is built across the world. It's built from land dispossession, from racial cleansing, from ownership and control of resources and the land. So that is why you find that right across the world, the people who do the most demeaning forms of labor are black people, are people from the global south, whereas the European white race is the one that is placed at the top of humanity in a racialized world. They are the ones who own the means of production. They are also the ones who determine which language must we use in areas of the media, areas of the church, areas of universities, knowledge, and schools, because part of the mission also of what is taking place in Gaza is to also determine the conversation around the world, to control how we think, to control the words we use to describe the situation there, because once you call it a war, they basically trying to justify the onslaught by Israel on the Palestinian people. And then they say, no, the Palestinian people are also killing us back as the Israelis. Whereas if you reframe it and call it colonialism and call it apartheid and call it a genocide, you will realize that actually the Palestinian people are only resisting the oppression, the colonialism that they are suffering from the Israel power, And when you resist, you are trying to save your life. You are trying to defend your own people. You are trying to defend your land, your livelihood, your dignity, So resistance will take any forms necessary to resist the abusive power that you are facing. And that also includes taking up arms to defend your own family, your own children, your own self, and your own community, So and the means of defense are also determined by the colonizing power. So Israel created the situation that is taking place in Gaza. It's their own creation, responsibility, and construction. And that is why as activists and scholars across the whole world in the global south, we're calling for a ceasefire, we're calling for justice, we're calling for reparations for the people of Palestine, and there must be no room whatsoever for dialogue or reconciliation against this murderous regime. There must just be justice for.
And what does that look like? What does that look like? Because Dr. Pedro, one of the challenges with where we find ourselves at the moment is that very large amounts of Palestinian land have been stolen. Not only was Israel as a very cancerous project implanted there, in the heart of the Middle East, in Palestine, that through successive years it has encroached and stolen more Palestinian land. It's become a feature year on year for new settlements to be announced, new cities to be announced, and we've had frequent and regular condemnations from the United Nations. We've had policy positions adopted that said a lot of these settler colonial cities that have sprung up, that they are against international law. The year that I think a lot of people have sort of defined as a Palestinian land and an Israeli land refers to 1967, based on that war that was fought in 1967. But the reality is that if we go back 75 plus years, that there is no scenario in which, of course, legitimacy can be given to the settler colonial entity and its project that it has had, in occupied Palestine for all these years. And so when we look at what is a solution, even a political solution here, it has often been claimed to be a two-state solution, which is a land for Palestine and a land for Israel. But again, where do we draw the boundaries? Where do we draw, the borders, as it were? And is that even a foolish conversation to be had when, if you look at the South African example, that we recognize that South Africa was colonized by the English, and then it was colonized by the Boers, and then you had a scenario in which indigenous black South Africans were pushed off from their land, the Khoi was pushed off from their land, and so on and so forth. And when it dawned upon us in the late 80s into the early 90s about what a future country could look like, there was a clear recognition that there is a one-state scenario, everybody will be allowed to vote, and that we need to begin to deal with the issue of the land, which we haven't been doing too greatly at. But the reality here is that by giving credence to a two-state solution is giving acknowledgement to Israel in its current shape, which is completely unjustly illegal, versus, telling Palestinians that whatever resources they are left with, that is for them, and plus it will be controlled by the settler colonial project. And so there are those practicality conversations that we need to begin to have about what a future will look like without Israel in its current form and its current shape as a settler colonial entity. Or talk to us about what, again, these considerations need to be sensitive of.
No, that's a very good conceptualization of the problem. And in South Africa, we are familiar with that situation and what it does to the colonized. For an example, one of the biggest debates in South Africa concerning citizenship and also concerning the territory was the adoption of the Freedom Charter in 1955, where the first clause declared that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, And the main issue there was, how can you give citizenship to white people? How can you give citizenship to Europeans, the people who came here and basically dispossessed Africans, enslaved them, killed and committed unspeakable crimes of genocide against indigenous black people. And they now occupy all strategic areas of the land, all strategic areas of the economy. Now, how can you therefore say that both black and white should belong in the single land? And that's when the Pan-Africanist Congress led by Sobukwe broke away from the ANC, which advanced the Freedom Charter. And look where we are today. You can see that the Pan-Africanist Congress of Sobukwe was correct. There's no way you can say the settler and also the native, basically the colonizer and the colonized, must share the same territory with equal rights to vote. That shouldn't be the case. The fundamental problem here is dispossession of the land that must be returned first and foremost to the indigenous black population of this country. Let the indigenous people gain control of the land, not just pieces of unoccupied land, but the entire land. The entire land belongs to the indigenous black population of this country. The European settlers got here through the process of colonization. Therefore, they don't belong here. So that should have been the primary focus of the conversation. If Europeans want to stay in Africa and be citizens in Africa, then they must obey the leadership of Africans. The Africans must be in control of their economy, their political systems, and then you as a European must come and stay in Africa according to the terms of Africans who are in control of their own land. That is the only way you're going to destroy white supremacy. That is the only way you're going to destroy white arrogance. That is the only way you're going to have a truly African society that belongs to Africans. Now, going to Israel and Palestine using the same template, the two-state solution is a wrong thesis to begin from, because Once you speak that language, you are basically cementing the dispossession and the enslavement of the Palestinians. And once you adopt a two-state solution, you are also saying the conversation concerning reparations and crimes against humanity committed on the Palestinians must also be a closed conversation, because why must we discuss those things? You've got your own state, now leave us alone. That shouldn't be the case. That whole land belongs to the Palestinian people. The Jews know that they are settlers there. They only arrived recently on that piece of land, and that should be the decolonial struggle that is pursued by the Palestinian people, and the whole world needs to be involved in that type of struggle. There needs to be sanctions against Israel. There needs to be condemnation of them. They shouldn't be allowed anywhere where the world meets. Ban them in sports, ban them in trade, ban them everywhere they think they can make some sort of a livelihood. And countries like Egypt are already moving in that direction. They have made it clear that what is taking place in Gaza should be condemned. They are allowing humanitarian aid to go through the border, and they are already calling for a ceasefire and more action to be taken against the Israelis. So the resolutions being adopted in the United Nations are going to continue being meaningless unless all nation states, including their economies, apply pressure and sanctions on Israel to stop these crimes against humanity. And there needs to be a concerted, coordinated effort for the Palestinian people to reclaim their land, to reclaim their independence, and to reclaim who they are as a people, because that is their land. So the two-state solution, we've seen it in South Africa already. The 1910 model that made white people citizens was then adopted in the 1996 Constitution, and look how South Africa looks like today. All arable areas of the land, the suburbs, the productive farms, the means of production, they are in the hands of white people, and that white wealth coexists with black poverty that is stripped of its dignity, that is pushed into the townships, right? And then we call that entire logic of dehumanization, we call it a nation, as we call it South Africa. That can never be a nation that looks like that. That is an apartheid geographic layout of a colonized society that needs to be dismantled and be started afresh. And that's the same logic that must apply in the area of Palestine.
Yeah, and we've seen a very passive response to the concept of an armed struggle. In a modern era scenario, that when we still have a settler colonial entity called Israel that is meting out its daily operations in keeping Palestinians enslaved, boxing them into an open air prison called Gaza, controlling their water, polluting their water sources sometimes, by throwing cement and feces and things into it, stealing their lands, killing them for plucking their own olives, determining how much of their water they can fish in, continuing stealing of their land and their resources, etc. There's almost a dictation here to the oppressed how they must respond to their own circumstance, as if though in the current setting we are the oppressed and we seek to determine the sensitivities with which and how they must respond. And you spoke a little bit about this a bit earlier, and you gave, of course, credence to even people like Frantz Fanon that says that the effort at decolonization is indeed a violent struggle to disrupt a colonial problem, that colonization has never gone quietly, that South Africa, at the height of apartheid, saw the writings on the wall that internationally, as you had called for Israel to be isolated, that it was isolated. And that when Mandela and Appler and the PAC and others said that, the only way to solidify this effort at freedom and liberation, it is through an armed struggle. And so, the almost disrespect sometimes they give to free thinkers, at least the mainstream media narrative is such that, that when the oppressed does rise up and respond, that they seek to demonize the way in which the oppressed responds. And if one looks purely at the legacy here of white settler colonialists, that they are known through generations and through several years for meting out genocide, for racially cleansing people, for dispossessing the indigenous people from their land, for purely, if you just look at our own experience, for rape, for torture, humiliation, burning of people's villages, ridding them of their cultures and disrespecting their cultures, etc. So what does it take? What will it take? For us to dismantle a settler colonial project like Israel, that we are told is the fourth largest army in the world, that has nuclear capabilities and so on, yet Palestinians are meant to show the other cheek?
Yeah, that's a very good question. For people to understand the armed struggle as an instrument of decolonization, people must also comprehend what is colonialism. First, because decolonization is a sharp response to colonization. Colonization is about capturing people's lands, enslaving their cultures, enslaving their families, their knowledges, stripping them away of their economies and means of life, stripping them of their dignity and bread, but most importantly, killing the potential, the capabilities, and the mental abilities of people, their ability, their talents, their ways of dreaming, of creating, of imagining their future, So colonization tampers with generations of families, it interferes and it interrupts the natural civilization of a people, of families, of children, So it's a life-threatening system that continues even in times when it is declared to have ended. It still continues, even in the psyches and the minds of people. It continues to stay with them because of the weight of how material it was when it was taking place as a physical conquest. Therefore, the response of the indigenous population to such a system will automatically be a disruptive phenomenon. It will be a violent phenomenon because you are dealing here with a force that comes at you with only one objective, and that objective is to kill. So when you gather response to that, you've got to also conscientize the people because arriving at armed struggle does not just happen automatically. The people must be educated, the people must be informed, the people must be trained, the people must be mobilized, galvanized for them to take ownership of that struggle. And therefore, the armed struggle is a defense against this system of colonization. And remember, these people taking up arms, they are created by the colonizing power. The colonizing power puts in place systems, processes that create how the slaves must live. It even seeks to determine how the slaves must respond to their own oppression. So this usage of knowledge and the media to basically tell the entire population in the world what is right and what is wrong, it's also an instrument of control. They seek to engineer the opinions of the people. They want to engineer how people must read the situation taking place in Gaza. They want to engineer and also control how people must shape the possible types of responses that should be there. I mean, just a few days ago, members of Senate that ordinarily the U.S. Senate that ordinarily would be credited for having progressive views like Bernie Sanders, the so-called Marxist leftist American politician, he still hasn't called what is taking place in Gaza by its name, Instead, he has chosen to be loyal to the U.S. colonial power by only calling for a humanitarian aid into Gaza. And we must make it clear, what is happening in Gaza is not some kind of an earthquake or a flood, that only requires food for those people to recover from it. No. What is taking place in Gaza is unspeakable crimes against humanity. It's a system of colonization that requires a disruptive, armed, decolonial response for the people of Palestine to be completely free. And after that, there must be consequences against the Israeli regime that has committed these crimes. And the consequences must be so decisive and so strong to send a strong message to any racist, colonial, abusive power and to any white person who thinks they can just dehumanize a black person without consequences. They must be dealt with harshly to send a strong message to one of them that they must never again think of dehumanizing a black person without consequences, So the essence of the armed struggle, therefore, is intended to uproot the colonizers who steal people's land. People who steal land must be eliminated through the struggle that is armed, because they are committing a crime of theft, but they are also committing unspeakable crimes against humanity. Because once you steal people's land, you basically push them down into poverty and generational struggles of unemployment and inequality forever. Therefore, to resist such crimes against humanity, all means necessary must be used, and all those means must be defined by the oppressed themselves.
And so those are very crucial questions that confront us in, again, our own understanding, our own history, and our own research and positioning on how we understand Israel and more so its onslaught on the Palestinians, that it isn't purely, this foolish effort to try and make this out to be a religious matter, or, a homeland for a people whose destiny was, the sacred lands of Palestine. This is about a settler colonial project, which is pretty white and is indeed a fallout of European imperialism that we see in play in that part of the world. And so that, I hope, strengthens our resolve and our understanding in how we look at certainly the occupation of Palestine at this very moment. And of course, there were moments and areas that we couldn't cover. For instance, like the media and the role that the media plays. But of course, I think we are all quite, to a certain degree, understandable that the media does, in fact, speak with a degree of power that is given to them by the established colonial powers. And as Steve Biko once said, the potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is their mind of the oppressed. And with this particular noble effort on our part, it's to reorientize this conversation that beyond you just saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or when there's a march shouting Allahu Akbar and so on, that that there's a broader thinking about the context and to contextualize certainly what is Israel, what Israel represents as a settler colonial project that is again a fallout of white imperialism.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.